Dobar.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, allow me to extend my gratitude for your participation at today's event, where we will speak about the effects of the food and energy crisis on the children in North Macedonia. Distinguished Minister of Economy, Besnik Bekteshi, Minister of Labor and Social Policy, Enver Hussein, dear UNICEF representative, Patrizia Di Giovanni. We're also expecting the President of the Regulatory Committee for Energetics, Marko Beslimovsky, dear guests, participants, media, and all of you who are following us online. This event is organized by UNICEF as part of the joint initiative of UNICEF and UNDP, which is done together in partnership with Finance Thing. As we know, starting from the pandemics until the Russian aggression over Ukraine, there have been several other crises, interrupted chains of supply, crisis with energy, high prices of food, which have very negative effect on the world economies as well as in our country, whereby thousands of citizens enter the poverty. The many years' efforts to tackle poverty has been reduced, even though the countries, including our country, are taking a series of measures in order to assist the most vulnerable categories of citizens. Especially important is the role of UNICEF providing long-term aid and humanitarian assistance to children and mothers in developing countries, and they have been present in the country since 1993 as one of the two UN agencies that opened offices here in the country once we gained independence. Today we will have the opportunity to hear and also to debate about several aspects of this crisis related to food and energy and how it impacts the children and families in our country. We will hear the messages of the authorities in the country, and we shall also speak about a study focused on the effects of the food and energy crisis on the well-being of households in our country, especially the impact of this crisis on children. At the very beginning, let's hear the introductory address of the Minister of Economy, Kresnik Bekteshi, Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Policy, Enver Hussein, and the UNICEF representative, Patrizia Di Giovanni. Minister Bekteshi, please take the floor. Good afternoon, distinguished Deputy Minister Hussein, distinguished Patrizia Di Giovanni, UNICEF representative, distinguished representatives of Finance Thing, of the government, non-governmental organizations, ladies and gentlemen. The Ministry of Economy, from the very beginning of the energy crisis, has been continuously taking measures to support the citizens. In addition to the fact that the country provided subsidies up to 80% of the energy for households and small consumers, as of last year, when the energy crisis started, we created a special program within the Ministry of Economy through which we implemented the activity to provide subsidies to the electricity bills for the most vulnerable categories of citizens. This measure is now continued throughout this year, and I can tell you that there is quite a big interest for this measure, having in mind that the expiry date is the 28th of this month, which means that over 28,000 families who belong in this category will be fully supported in terms of payment of electricity bills. When it comes to the category of households, from 600 to 800 dinars will be paid monthly for each of the electricity bills, and in case there is 10 or more percent of savings on electricity bill, there will be extra 200 or 300 dinars, in addition to the support provided by the electricity company to the government of North Macedonia. At certain times, we would even provide triple support to the electricity bills on the regulated energy market. In the last 2 years, we have provided 100% coverage by the state. The Ministry of Economy, in addition to the measures that are designed in the last years, especially from the beginning of the pandemics, has been also working together with the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy on designing programs for energy poverty, and this is already stipulated in the new law on energy that was drafted together with the USAID representatives in order to ensure targeted measures. And of course, the effects and the impact on the most vulnerable categories are even bigger. Without further ado, on behalf of the institution and the government, on behalf of the President of the government, Mr. Kovachevsky, I would like to say that such analyses and conferences are more than welcome, especially the findings deriving out of the studies, because they can definitely be embedded in the government programs in terms of how we manage both the economy and the energy crisis. All the findings, or most of the findings and the recommendations deriving out of the debates that we're having today, and also the analysis undertaken by UNICEF and Finance Think as a Minister of Economy, and also on behalf of the Prime Minister, I hereby make a public promise that all these findings will be taken into consideration and will be included in the new measures to support the vulnerable categories of citizens in our country. We passed a very difficult period has already passed. Now we kind of stabilize the economy, not in the country, but also at European level. And definitely we will be fully committed that in parallel to the support for the vulnerable categories, that we also work on the economic development in general. As of March, we will also increase the minimum wage. Also, we will increase the salaries in the public administration in parallel to the increase of salaries in the private sector. Having in mind that this is a market economy, we will have to take some administrative measures in order to protect the most vulnerable ones. The President of the Regulatory Committee will explain the analysis being undertaken about the electricity price, so that with the new decision, as of 1st of July, we will provide assistance to retired people, to unemployed people, and also we are considering of returning the cheap tariff during the day for all of those citizens who spend the day at home, and this is a direct support to them. Once again, I would like to congratulate you on the excellent organization. I would like to thank UNICEF for this direct support they are providing for the design of policies, and also I would like to thank Finance Think, with whom we have been working on continuous basis on other economic policies in the country, which according to all the analyses are actually yield results. Once again, I would like to highlight the position of the government that all recommendations and ideas that are sustainable will be accepted, and based on data, we will take measures in the interest of the citizens. Thank you. Thank you, Minister Bekteshi. Now I give the floor to the Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Policy, Enver Hussein, to address the audience. Thank you. Distinguished Minister of Economy, Mr. Bekteshi, distinguished UNICEF representative, Ms. Di Giovanni, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, allow me, first of all, on my personal behalf, on behalf of the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, to welcome all of you and to wish you a successful and productive debate. When it comes to today's event, I would also like to extend my gratitude to UNICEF for organizing this event, but also for inviting me and for giving us a chance to address you and share our positions with regard to the reforms, programs, and measures of the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy. That is what we have done so far together with the government of the Republic of North Macedonia. I will try to say a few things about the measures. Just like the Minister of Economy said, that we have close cooperation with all other ministries, having in mind that we are in the middle of the global economic crisis that is also affecting North Macedonia. It's a huge responsibility to speak from this position about the effect of the food and energy crisis over children and families, especially from a position of a Ministry of Labor and Social Policy. The past several years were very challenging, and they were testing the preparedness of the systems, among which is the system for social welfare and tackling crisis. During the COVID-19 crisis, with targeted financial measures for the vulnerable beneficiaries, the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy actually tried to mitigate the price shocks that were imposed by the markets. In parallel, we also provided social services that also provided appropriate care for citizens in need, and these were services covered and provided by the state, but also services provided by authorized private service providers. In the middle of the economic crisis and the announced food crisis, we are facing another challenge that would require us to provide the best possible solutions to protect everyone. Therefore, we increased the price of the special allowance for 15% for all subtypes of beneficiaries. In addition, in January, we harmonized the rights from social welfare and child rights based on the living costs. In January, beneficiaries received 14% rights, 14% higher allowances, which means that the total increase is above 30%. Also, the price for delivered services by authorized providers has been increased for 15% this year. So in addition to the beneficiaries, this also provides affects the service providers through the project to improve social services supported by the World Bank. So far, we have given grants to 34 projects implemented in 41 municipalities. Another thing that matters is to provide for sustainability. That is, once the project ends, these services are further provided to the citizens. Therefore, the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy concludes management contracts to finance the services, and so far we have concluded 20 such contracts. Speaking of services, it is worth noting the process of deinstitutionalization, which is a very successful social measure. With the introduction of new residential units for supported living, in the past 2020, we opened 16 residential units with supported living for 80 beneficiaries. A specific social policy that the ministry created and the government approved, and also refers to the energy crisis, refers to the financial support for vulnerable and social categories of citizens. To that end, we drafted a law on financial support for vulnerable categories of citizens in order to tackle the energy crisis. The beneficiaries of these measures are elderly people who receive social beneficiaries, those who receive disability allowance, special allowance, and also beneficiaries of guaranteed minimum wage. Also, beneficiaries of pension up to 14,000 denars. Also beneficiaries of allowance for physical disability and also other social categories. The financial support for socially vulnerable categories of citizens to tackle the energy crisis. All this has been done for the past 3 months, and in March we will do the fourth payment. In accordance with this law, a right to financial support is given to over 36,000 beneficiaries. In addition, over 130,000 beneficiaries of pension, up to 14,000 denars, and also those who receive the allowance for physical disability, and over 5,000 beneficiaries who receive financial allowance. In addition to these measures, we also paid up to 3,000 denars to all 330,000 pensioners and those who received the guaranteed minimal assistance. The range of users actually is a proof that we create beneficial policies in order to tackle crisis. As a Minister of Labor and Social Policy, we are aware that to meet the needs and to ensure the quality of life for all our citizens, this is our ultimate goal, being also fully aware that the realization will be full of challenges. However, persistence is a characteristic of those who are most courageous. In addition to the parallel support, we will extend the network of service providers, especially for individual treatment of children with disabilities. Now we are in the final stage of drafting the strategy for the rights of people with disabilities up to the year 2030. Also, the law on social enterprises, which will provide direct response to the poverty, and also how to deal with especially vulnerable category of citizens. We do believe with only with responsible policies and mutual cooperation, we will be able to tackle the challenges that we face, just like we have done before. Finally, I would like to thank you for this event and for the invitation. And as the Minister of Economy mentioned, the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy is also always at disposal to all the citizens in the country, and we shall continue taking care of our citizens like we did so far. We will be taking new measures, adopting new laws.
2023, the assessment shows that the continuing significant price increases would push an additional 20,000 below the poverty line, including an additional 5,000 children. That's a total of 10,000 children. The rising prices have also led to effective decrease in the purchasing power of the cash benefits for vulnerable groups by 14%, and that's corresponding to the increased consumer price index. The worsening of food poverty is severe. Food poverty rates soared by 9% points for children. The increase is staggering amongst families with 3 or more children at 14.5 percentage points. With the government and municipal budgets coming under stress due to rising costs and expected dip in public revenues, the authorities may have difficulties in meeting all the needs for added social protection measures. Furthermore, funding for other basic social services, including education and health, may also be at risk due to the rising cost of electricity and heating for the facilities, which is substantially burdening the national and municipal budgets. I personally spoke to many mayors over the last 3 or 4 months about keeping schools open for the heating costs, and I'm glad that that was done over the last few months. Government measures are estimated to have softened the effects of the crisis, particularly for children. Estimates suggest that income support measures saved 4,500 individuals from poverty, of which 1,100 children, these are other children than the ones I've already mentioned, of which 1,100 are children. The price control measures were even more effective, helping 12,100 people, of which 3,400 were children, to avert poverty. So that's what the government has done and what the current measures have saved. Part of the policy response measures were equally helping poor and rich households, hence reducing poverty, but also aiding income of families which are not in the critical need for assistance. During our consultations with key authorities and other key stakeholders, and working jointly with UNDP and FAO and the Resident Coordinator's Office, we have identified potential additional measures that the national and local authorities may consider. Please allow me to go through some of these additional measures. Expand the energy subsidy to most vulnerable families and relax the eligibility, English is my first language, eligibility criteria of the Guaranteed Minimum Assistance, the GMA, for key vulnerable groups of households. Such measures have proved to be very effective in addressing the secondary impact of COVID-19 on households. Replicate the reforms of adjusting the pensions to the cost of living to the cash transfers for vulnerable households. More frequent indexation of the cash benefits in accordance with the rise of prices, for example, maybe twice a year, instead of the current annual adjustment, will ensure that they preserve their value in an environment of significantly rising prices. The third one, closely analyse the effects of the new energy pricing methodology introduced in July 2022 on vulnerable households. The methodology will likely result in the disproportional rise in energy costs for larger families, including families with 3 or more children, which are already more exposed to the risk of poverty and often are already quite financially challenged. In the context of rising budgetary pressures at national and municipal level, protect basic health services, social protection and education by increasing efficiency, effectiveness and equity in social spending. In particular, all efforts must be made to keep schools open even amidst the soaring prices, to ensure that children from vulnerable households do not suffer from further learning losses. Following good practices from the EU, for example, systematically introducing programs such as the Free School Feeding Program, if well designed and implemented, such a program would not only improve access to healthy and nutritious food for school children, but also reduce poverty as well as support domestic partners, domestic producers. UNICEF and other UN entities will continue to support the government with timely evidence and the effects of unfolding crisis, as well as technical support in the strengthening of available policies, especially social safety nets for the most vulnerable population. I would also like to express our gratitude and appreciation for the support from the Joint Sustainable Development Goals Fund, which enabled us to conduct comprehensive analysis, consultations, and to design actionable policy recommendations for the authority. Blagodaram.
Благодарам, госпожа.
Thank you very much, Ms. Giovanni. I would like to welcome the President of the Regulatory Energy Commission, Mr. Beslimovsky. Before we go to the next agenda item, I would like to thank the Minister of Economy, Mr. Bekteshi, the Deputy Minister of Social Policy, Hussein. They have other commitments in the government, so the topic is well known to all of you, and we would expect today to watch the news and to see your feedback on that. So thank you very much for your attendance. Now I would like to welcome the presentation of the study, the effects of the energy and food crisis on the well-being of households in Children Republic of North Macedonia, represented by Professor Marian Petreski, one of the authors of the study, on behalf of Finance Thing, as well as Alexander Nikolov, a representative of UNICEF. Maybe just a few words on the study. It incorporates and considers the global developments, the exposure of domestic economy, especially in terms of ever-growing prices, then the developments in our country vis-à-vis the economy, the prices and the indicators of poverty, and the consumption on the level of households. The governmental measures are analyzed to tackle the adverse effects of the crisis. Simulations have already been incorporated, and in the end it involves conclusions and recommendations on further policies. Very interesting things to hear about. Now I would like to present the authors, both from Finance Think and UNICEF representatives, to give an overview of the study.
Почитувани представници институции.
The representatives of the institutions of the Government Republic of North Macedonia, the independent regulatory bodies, the representatives of the agencies of the UN, dear attendees, dear journalists, media, dear guests, I would like to wish you on my personal behalf and on behalf of Finance Thing a warm welcome on today's debate. That which was greatly overviewed by Mrs. Stoyanovsky. We're going to present the study, the heading of which you can read behind me. A lot of things were said about the context for the drafting of this study. Following my understanding, this is probably the first one that incorporates an in-depth estimate of the effects of the energy and food crisis over the well-being and the welfare of households with children in its focus. Just briefly, at the very start, I would like to just give a visual overview of the background of the study, even though the numbers were already discussed by the introductory panelist speakers. What we saw during 2022, even though the effect was seen mid-2021, was significant acceleration and growth in prices. Why is that important? Because they affect the real income or the purchase power of the population. We can see in the graph behind in a wider time frame starting 2010, we got used to having low prices, not more than 2% rise annually, and now since the end of 2021 suddenly we have a prompt acceleration of the growth in prices, increase in prices, inflation rate reaching over 20% levels in November 2022, and the entire year was concluded with 22.2%. Luckily, this trend is in decline, so we're kind of stabilizing rates currently. In addition to the income, the nominal income was also affected. What was projected prior to the Russian aggression in Ukraine, a 4% of real growth of the GDP during the year, it had a downward spiral and it was halved. So now the expectations are that it will grow around 2% to 2.5% in 2022 and in 2023, and the estimate for the GDP. That is the growth of the GDP in our economy revolves around just above 4%. So we are slightly below the full potential of the economy. So the effects were in real and in nominal sense affecting the income during the past year. The income was supported by two packages of governmental measures talked about by the governmental representatives, but I'm just going to summarize them. One affected the prices, meaning addressed the real income. We all know here certain food items had frozen margins, and direct subsidies were provided, especially when it comes to heating and electricity, whereas the other segment of measures tackled directly the nominal income. First and foremost, the direct cash benefits for certain segments, so more vulnerable categories of citizens and pensioners. Only part were targeted, which means that they directly targeted a particular audience, whereas the others were linear, meaning they affected the entire population. And that is important since the crisis did not target each and every category equally. We know that certain segments felt more dire effects of the crisis, especially the households with 3 or more children and those that were more vulnerable, than children that prior to the crisis, even pre-pandemic, in pre-pandemic times, faced higher poverty rate compared to the other segments, and women that faced higher rate of inactivity in the labor market, which means less income and less paid domestic work. That was especially prominent during the pandemic times. Then it's characteristic that the low-income households spent more of their budget on food. In a relative sense, they spent around 50% of their budget on food. And the way we reach the higher income quintile, that percentage drops to around 45%, but the differences are not that big. To the contrary of this, we have the scheme when it comes to the energy consumption. We have the total utility here, supply of gas, water, electricity, and the higher income families spend more on utility costs. And if we take the prior into consideration, then we see that they are compensating one another. The poorer families are more dependent on the electricity consumption in relative terms. We can see on the left-hand side that, and the threshold or the line that talks about the share of the electricity consumption in the overall household income. What does the study do? Now I will come to the moment to presenting the results, the findings of the study. Just briefly, we're simulating the effect of the crisis on the well-being of the households with the McCommod model. Those that are interested in the methodology of the McCommod, the study will be available in the next few days. We're building on to the absolute and relative poverty rates as prescribed in the survey. The statistical office renders such data and the World Bank by introducing thresholds that were recently updated. And the study, for the first time in the public discourse here in our country, introduces two indicators which are relevant to the currently crisis, energy and food crisis, and that is the rate of energy poverty, that is the share of households that spend more than 10% of their income on energy, and food poverty, that is the share of households that spend more than 20% of their income on essential nutrition. Essential food items mean wheats, eggs, bread, cheese, and oils, and then we are desegregating these to see which segment of the population is under the biggest threat and most vulnerable, and where should we target future measures in order to achieve the favorable effect on one hand as per the indicators, and on the other hand to safeguard the fiscal space, for which we are going to discuss on the following slides. This chart, left-hand column, you can see the 5 indicators that we calculate, and the first row shows the population groups for which we are calculating the indicators. We can see the first column refers to the entire population, then we have only children, and then they are desegregating by gender, by number of children in a household, type of education of the head, and then the number of children, so on. So what do the numbers show? The numbers show the difference, meaning how many percentage point falling under certain indicators can rise when compared to the effects of the energy and food crisis. Here we have the 2022 depicted situation, taking into consideration the measures that were in effect. Now we can see that all of the indicators all of the differences are positive, meaning that all of the rates, poverty rates, do experience increase in the level of poverty due to the crisis. Now I would like to talk about the absolute poverty, and that is the third row. Deterioration of 1.3 percentage points in the entire population, whereas the effect on children is even bigger, 1.9 percentage points worsening of the situation. And Ms. Patricia talked about this, that due to the crisis, this implies that additional 13,000 people fell under the poverty line, out of which children are 3,000. So we can see that we have dramatic rise of the rate, especially amongst children. The 14.5 percentage point is the greatest rise in households having 3 or more children, meaning that children are more affected compared to the adults, whereas multiple children households or families, in addition to this risk, do suffer hunger risk as well. With regard to the government measures, now we're going to have that on the next slide. The measures tackling the income is the first group, the second the price measures, and the third group of results are the two combined. We can see the negative numbers here. These are negative numbers, meaning that the measures have indeed facilitated or mitigated energy effects, which means that they did affect the steps here, or hadn't the measures been implemented, then the numbers would have been bigger by the amounts represented here in the charts referring poverty and other. And the biggest effect was amongst the multi-children families, and the effect on children was greater than the effect on adults. That doesn't mean that because the measures explicitly targeted children, but that these groups already were experiencing higher poverty rates to begin with. What was already said by Ms. Di Giovanni, the negative side of the measure is that they equally or almost equally assisted the low income as well as the higher income families. Left, you can see the measures that address the income. On the right-hand side, the measures that address prices. Going left to right, we move from the most poor to the higher income families, and we can see the prices that the effects on all decile group are the same, which means equal help that was provided for all households. Whereas the income measures, we do have certain differentiation. Truly, they did help the left-hand side of the distribution, but we do still have a lot of funds from the state budget that did help the higher income families, those that could have handled the crisis blow on their own. And what in the end the study does is to estimate the effect of the crisis that is still ongoing in 2023, so extended influence. The price shock will continue to be transmitted on the wider consumer basket. We can see now that certain specific food items will experience reduction in prices, but for the entire year, the inflation rate will remain fairly high as a result of transmitted effect. The nominal income will continue to rise. We do have certain planned adjustments of the income of the pensions, social benefits, certain pressures on the labor market. When it comes to the segment that is left without governmental intervention, but mainly the pressure on the nominal income is the downward spiral due to the fact that the fiscal space has significantly been narrowed down, which limits and restricts the potential of the fiscal policies to react as in previous times. But we also propose that the linear measures will be terminated, but we do not expect for them to be replaced. But on the basis of this, we will identify any potential future design of such linear measures. Unfortunately, the results, the findings are negative in terms of the fact that the poverty is stretching throughout 2023, especially seen in the absolute poverty of $6.8 per day, the third line. The child poverty due to the VAT increase has been worsened, whereas we await prices stabilization, food prices stabilization, and reduction, drop in prices in certain food items, and that may have favorable effects on the effects of the crisis. My colleague Alexander will continue with the recommendations.
Thank you, Maria. Some of the recommendations were already mentioned by Ms. Patrizia Di Giovanni. I will try to provide more details on the recommendations. One thing that was already mentioned by the previous speakers are the favorable effects of the measures to tackle the energy poverty. The Minister of Economy mentioned the subsidies to fight the energy poverty, which are provided by the Ministry. The Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, as part of the guaranteed minimal assistance during the heating season from November till March, is paying certain allowance for energy to most vulnerable households. This allowance is 1,140 dinars. We believe that the amount of this subsidy should be re-examined and should be increased proportional to the increase of the prices in energy, having in mind also the prospective rise in prices of all other energy agents. Another thing that the government can consider as additional measure, And something that has proved to be quite effective in tackling the socioeconomic effects of the COVID-19 pandemics, and that was to alleviate the conditions to access minimal guaranteed assistance. So there were no longer requirements for these households that they have property or vehicle on their name. During the COVID-19 pandemics, this allowance for energy was extended from 6 to 12 months in the course of the year. According to our calculations and the simulations that we were doing together with Finance Think, we saw that this had very positive impact on tackling the negative effects of the pandemics. Also, the crisis with the price of energy and food. Also, this has pressurized the budgets of the institutions providing basic social services, education, healthcare, as well as social protection. Some of these institutions, in order to be able to provide services based on the existing budgets, they started applying some restrictions in the service delivery. Some of the school directors and teachers were saying that they had to shorten the classes so that the school day is not that long, which means that the cost for electricity and heating would be lower. We think that this practice should be stopped. That is, reducing the quality of services should stop. And here we need to make interventions in terms of increasing the efficiency of these costs. UNICEF is already working with the Ministry of Education how to improve the efficiency of expenditures in primary and secondary education. This will be then extended to other types of services, but also to ensure that the quality of these services will not be endangered. Ms. Patrizia Di Giovanni already mentioned that the huge rise in food price also leads to rapid increase in the number of households in poverty. This is something that should be considered by the government, the Ministry of Education, and as well as the Ministry of Agriculture, in terms of introducing a free of charge program for nutrition in schools. The European Union is providing this as part of the European Guarantee for Children, and this is also in compliance with a new concept on primary education, according to which children will be spending more hours at school. That is, they will be spending up to 7 hours at school. So they will not only get regular teaching, but also extracurricular activities in the school. If we shift to a longer school day, the state should also provide free nutrition that is ideal for all students. And if this cannot be provided as part of the school budgets, this can be introduced at the very beginning as a program targeting the most vulnerable students. Another thing that should be praised about the measures of the government is the application of new methodology, how to do the indexing of pensions. That is, that there is a 6-month harmonization of the amount of pensions with the living costs and also the change in the amount of salaries. We think this measure is fine. However, it should be extended to the social welfare beneficiaries. In June last year, there was a significant increase in prices. However, the harmonization of the social welfare with the living costs was effected in January 2023. We think that this harmonization should be done on more frequent basis, and this is how we're going to retain the value of the social welfare. Also, there is a need to re-examine the methodology for the block tariffs that was introduced last year. These are block tariffs for electricity, and we think that this can have disproportionately negative impact on households with many children. I do hope that we will cooperate with the Regulatory Commission for Energy. We will propose mechanisms how to avoid such negative impact. Thank you.
Profesore Petrevski, gospodin. Narede panel diskusji.
Now we'll have a panel discussions, measures, policies, challenges and preconditions for success. Let me introduce the panelists and also to invite them to come on the stage. Marko Beslimovski, President of the Regulatory Commission for Energy, Dusan Tomšič, Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, Maya Gerovska-Midov, Faculty of Philosophy, and Viktor Andonov, Prime Minister's Advisor for Energy. My name is Mircea Jovanovski, journalist in the newspaper Nezavisan. I'm the moderator of this event. Good afternoon, everyone, once again. Let me mention that once we've finished the questions for the panelists, we will allow the audience also to ask questions to the panelists and also to the presenters of the study. We heard the recommendations of this study. We need to relax the conditions for access to minimal guaranteed assistance and also to harmonize the assistance provided with the current living conditions, also to take it into consideration the consumption of the households, also the energy subsidies as part of the guaranteed minimal assistance, which is paid by the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, and the subsidy paid through the Ministry of Economy. This should also be further adjusted for multi-children families. also to reduce the non-targeted subsidies for energy, the transfers from the budget to the energy company, and reduced VAT for the price of electricity. Also, exceptions should be made for those who receive minimal guaranteed assistance so that they can pay the cheapest tariff of electricity. According to the simulations, nutrition poverty is on the increase, so there is a proposal to introduce free of charge nutrition or meals in schools, especially for those families that receive education allowance. So we have plenty of topics for discussion. I will start with Mr. Beslimovsky. The first question is that the analysis shows that the measures to tackle the energy poverty yield results, because the situation of the most vulnerable families is still not worsened. However, we can improve the efficiency with these measures, because with the subsidized price of energy and reduced VAT, we are also supporting households who do not need that. Thank you for inviting me. The only good thing out of this energy crisis that takes place in the past 2 years is that we started talking about the energy. We are a developing country. We cannot be country in development unless we have a well-developed energy sector. With no investments in energy in the past 30 years, we have reached a point where we pay for the fact that we were not making any previous investments. The state provided subsidies in 2020, 2021, 2022. I guess this will continue 2023. Obviously, we are successfully extinguishing the fire out of the energy crisis. These are price shocks, especially for the households, and we managed to avoid this. As possible for the small consumers, we provide a lower price than the market price, and there are additional other consumers in the food industry, public communal enterprises, educational institutions, as well as hospitals. I think that they get a price which is far lower than the market price. So whenever there is a problem, we try to help. But let's see what is happening to the energy poverty before this crisis and how our country was tackling this problem. It's a fact that the assistance for the energy poverty is around 1,000 dinars a month. And this is provided 6 months a year. This measure has been extended, so it's in the range of 1,000 dinars on a monthly basis, and this is provided to households that receive social benefits. And I would say that this is a very small category of citizens using this assistance from the country, and this assistance is provided directly to their bank accounts. And we assume that this money will be spent for the energy poverty, but in reality, this money is really used for the energy poverty. Out of the existing concept, we need to develop a new concept and a new system. First of all, we need to distinguish that cheap price of electricity, as we used to have, is not always the solution. Because with a cheap price, you can keep the social peace for a certain period of time. And this cheap price is also used by households that would not have a problem to cover the electricity bills. So we need to detect who should be assisted. Obviously, that the assistance that is being provided is only for a few number of households. This is what I'm highlighting at various events and also in the media. We need to definitely change the concept of assistance. We need to reach a point where we have available data on the income by head of household. The lower the income, the bigger the assistance should be. As the income of a household increases and the assistance it gets from the country will be reduced. This way, we will allow for normal development of the energy sector without any politicization of this topic. We need to have prices that realistically reflect the prices of the energy providers. Not like the prices in some of the water supply companies. We need to provide real prices that reflect the real operation expenditures. This will provide also for normal operation of the companies such as MEPSO and ESAMA. Those are the energy companies. And this is how we're going to target the assistance to those who are most in need. It's a fact that we realized that before the blocks were introduced, speaking from the aspect of the market, this is not a market measure. This is a measure that punishes, and it is introduced in a situation when we have extremely high consumption by households, and we do not have that much electricity. And the electricity that we produce is done along with export components. Now we import coal, we import electricity. Tesna Gutino is not fully operational. So all this has certain impact on the price of electricity. And the price of electricity must be realistic. And we need to target those households, regardless if the person receives pension, minimum wage, etc. I think that this data cannot be easily provided, but I'm certain that we can provide the baseline data because we did the census a year ago. And the data from the aspect of income should be cross-checked with the Public Revenue Office. And also the data that we'll get from the Public Revenue Office should be cross-checked with the energy data. Because maybe the electricity meter of one household is registered on someone else's name and other people live there. So we need to first collect the data, provide the baseline data, ensure the database, and only then we can create real policies that will yield the right results. So as soon as possible, we should start thinking of changing the concept how to tackle the energy poverty. And this concept should be raised to a high level, and our country should finally start solving this problem. Also, a mention was made of multi-children families. We still have not conducted an analysis. And most probably there is bigger consumption. But those multi-children families with the concept of income by head of household should be given the assistance they really need and deserve. Among others, also to relax the electricity sector, and also to ensure that they can make new investments. Investments should not always be linked with budget grants. It doesn't make sense. A company that is in private or state ownership, each company should be working by making profits in order to generate further development. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Beslimovsky. Very interesting ideas. Here we have the Prime Minister's advisor. Later on, he will be elaborating on your ideas. First, let me ask Mr. Tomšić. how this is linked to the findings of the study. The analysis shows that the government measures yielded the results, how to reduce the negative effects of the crisis. What were the new measures introduced, and did the Ministry of Labour and Social Policy think of upgrading those measures according to the recommendations in the study? First of all, thank you for the invitation, for giving me this opportunity to share our views about these proposals. I carefully reviewed this. Colleague Bislimovsky raised some topics that we have been thinking about at policy level. What I'm trying to say is that with the introduction of the minimal guaranteed assistance, this amount to 25,000 beneficiaries, and now in 2023 we have 36,000 such beneficiaries, which means that this is well-designed measure that responds to the crisis situations, and it's flexible to target all individuals who lose jobs and can be shifted to the system of social welfare. One thing that I would like to highlight, that according to the data of our ministry, the number of households receiving minimal guaranteed assistance already stated, but many of these households, around 11,000 or 31.7%, receive children's allowance, and every fifth household also receives education allowance, which generates income for the family, for the household. The most recent measure is to provide assistance to vulnerable categories. And that is the loan financially support vulnerable categories that was adopted in October. The first payments started in November and refers to financial assistance of 3,000 lenders in a period of 4 months to several categories of citizens that previously, under conditions of COVID and economic crisis, were not covered by the packages. Those are people who receive disability allowance, families with children with disabilities, pensioners with pension below 14,000 dinars, beneficiaries of the allowance for physical disability. That's another big group of people which is pressurizing the budgets of our country. Colleague Bislimovsky mentioned something related to income of the households, but here I would like to highlight something. We have a lot of grey economy. That is why you cannot measure the income by family member. The information that we have show that we have quite a huge grey economy, and there is a big number of people who receive certain allowances, but their income is nowhere registered. So it's quite difficult to link the number of household members and to determine the amount of income by member of household. That's another problem that we discussed at the Ministry of Finance related to the electricity meters. Often these people live in rented apartments. The meter is not on their behalf because the bills they get are linked to a code for consumption. So the electricity companies suggest the systems to the registration of social welfare beneficiaries. If you see the structure of people exposed to poverty, you see the educational status of people who are entitled to certain rights. These are people without primary without primary education, without secondary education. Most of our unemployed people, around 100,000, are with this education structure. This is quite a deeper problem. The passive measures that are helping in the short run to extinguish the fire, as Bislimovsky said, we should not be imposing this in the long run. We need to include the education systems, the system for education, so that these people can manage their lives. Everything that happens with regard to the targeted measures does help under conditions of crisis, but only in the short run. In the long run, we need to focus on further education, providing skills for these people so that they can take care about their families themselves, rather than increasing the amounts that they should receive. With the payment done in March, we will provide increase of 14%. This is one of the biggest increases ever in our country. Usually it was 1 to 2%. Only the special allowance, according to the new adjustments, will increase by 30%. Pensions were increased by 15%. With the new alignments, it will be up to 20%. So this has certain effect on the budget, but also on the other economic policies and the capital investments, which actually affect the country. And we need to be thinking how all these categories of citizens can be engaged on the labor market.
По-успешно интегрирање на луѓето кои што примаат социјална помош, да може да се вклучат во пазарот на трудот, и целата оваа проблематика очигледно е многу комплексна и причина повеќе, нели, да се вложат уште повеќе напори да се сузбие сивата економија.
We need to address these issues even further and then to tackle the economy and create packages that will further provide assistance. As an expert, Ms. Mita, expert in the area of social protection, what are your views when it comes to the efficiency and efficacy of the governmental measures? Do you have any recommendations for their improvement? Thank you very much for your question, for the invitation. Congratulations on the study that in this context of being deficient when it comes to the statistical data and overview and recommendations of the that address the effects of the crisis is hugely welcome, and most certainly it was very beneficial that certain provisions were in-depth analyzed. In addition to what was introduced in 2022 in the social protection system, when it comes to the law and material assistance of the socially vulnerable categories that were assisted in the time period of 4 months, even though they're more than welcome, what I can say that is a bit surprising, or our experience in creating the social protection reform in 2019, we realized that we need to stop with the fragmentation of the legislation, regulation, and the competencies of the institution when it comes to the cash benefits. So now we're going to introduce a new law that will be applicable for about 4 months. The crisis was indicative in order to introduce 2020 amendments to legislation, whereby we introduced in times of crisis the beneficiaries, the vulnerable beneficiaries, those that received the guaranteed minimum assistance, to receive certain benefit. So this type of legislative complication of things by adding different or additional assistance complicates and aggravates the benefits that we actually provide and the entitlements. So what we need to do is to integrate all the assistance and benefits in the main law. Additionally, the measures for 2022 through the Ministry of Economy, and there is the public call announcement ends today for public consumer providers selection. What I want to emphasize here is that the program is national and is being supplied once the budget is fully allocated. So not all eligible beneficiaries or recipients will receive the necessary assistance. In 2023, we had targets that were identified per number of households, and I don't know why was this the case, because in 2023 we supplemented the targets, and instead of encompassing and capturing more households, as the study also shows that those are the most vulnerable ones, the amount was enhanced to include different types of families or households. The new law on material assistance of vulnerable categories to provide energy subsidies. We had a very visible stigmatization because the names and the beneficiaries were made public with names, first, last names, addresses, and so on. So I thought this was already a terminated practice, and they have public numbers, and without the knowledge, the public knowledge, they can be notified. So that's one thing. Even though the study does show a situation of food-related crisis and energy poverty, official statistical data with regards to this situation, even though we do not have it for the current year, linked to the number of households being unable to effectively heat their home, around 23%, and related to the indicator of to what extent households can allow themselves meat or other nutritional products, amount of 30% of families or households, additionally show that these type of measures need to be extended and need to be continued. This is a UNICEF-supported event, so guided by the UNICEF guidelines, the government has to consider financial ability to introduce a meal in the elementary schools. Such experiences in Croatia have already been introduced in 2023. In 2022 in Montenegro, they had a universal child allowance that was introduced, and that was especially important. And what was also introduced and shown by the study, that maybe provisionally this can be introduced for the most vulnerable categories. Again, this would provide a stigma, because how do you think it will look when only the most vulnerables will receive a meal? So the universal approach is the most beneficial one. Thank you very much. I fully agree with your view, especially the lists of having last first and last names made public should be avoided. They have to find another way to notify the recipients or the beneficiaries, or whether they have or have not received beneficial. Mr. Andonov, as an energy advisor, you have all necessary information and data regarding measures that need to be adopted. So in this context, in addition to what Mr. Beslimovsky proposed, but it also in context of the requests of the IMF to approve the last credit line, the latest credit line, is that the government should adopt a plan for a subsequent cancellation of the energy company subsidies who are inefficient. So how can we put this into effect in order to safeguard the most vulnerable families, and that they're not going to additionally burden the budget expenditure, and to what extent, and how do you assess the so far measures to tackle the crisis? Thank you very much. I'll start with the last question. I think that was the actual subject of today's discussion in the study. We could see that the majority of measures had a positive effect when it comes to policies introduced to tackle child poverty, but also, in principle, to reduce the economic poverty that came as a result of the several subsequent crises in the past period. Most specifically, I would like to talk about the energy segment, the vulnerable energy consumers, since we committed to cover them by the means of the energy law adopted in 2018, in accordance with which we did prepare a program to safeguard and protect vulnerable energy consumers, and several other programs were adopted by the government. In the debate with the previous speakers, we talked about guaranteed minimum assistance, and we need to make a differentiation here, because we're talking about one category of beneficiaries, and vulnerable consumers are another category of consumers, because their social category is such that they do not have any income, they're being assisted, whereas vulnerable category of consumers from an energy aspect is another category. And throughout Europe in the past 10, 15 years, measures and policies are being adopted to address and cover these categories. Prior to the conference, I found an information that pre-COVID times 24,000 EU citizens had difficulties in heating their homes. I'm talking about pre-pandemic times, let alone post-pandemic times and following the crisis in Ukraine. Vulnerable categories are mainly linked to the high energy or fuel costs, poor energy efficiency in the homes, and the low income level. We started with such policies pursuant to the low energy, but when it comes to the effects of the energy crisis or the steep prices, in addition to having adverse effects, when it comes to preparing a systemic solution, we need to have a positive yield, because we all know now what does an inaccessible or high or expensive energy or electricity means today. So, together with the government, we realized that initially we need to, instead of having secondary legislation, introduce amendments to the law on energy. And that was being done, and now we're going to have a secondary legislation in the form of a regulation that is going to be prepared together with the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy. And Ministry of Economy talked about the financial assistance that was started for low-income households, depending on the category they fall into, whether we're talking about a family of 1, 2, or more. This is a start towards a systemic solution, because those are discussions that we need to ascertain the exact number of users, beneficiaries, measures, packages, and I think the set of measures that are being proposed will be a good baseline for future activities. Even the very change in the concept of the tariffs, including 4 categories by the Energy Regulatory Committee, is a start. They focused on the consumption, and one of the initiatives was to reduce consumption and incite savings. That needs to be upgraded when we talk about the vulnerable categories. And now within the USAID project, as mentioned by the Minister of Economy, we will work on a systemic solution, providing a database of vulnerable categories of consumers, taking into consideration all of the aspects that we mentioned with the devices and how will they be linked to the beneficiaries. Ministry of Economy, for years now, have had energy efficiency programs in place, but we can conclude that during the past years' initiatives, replacing old windows, installing inverters and other energy efficiency measures introduced already are linked closely to the income of the family, and we will attempt to tackle vulnerable categories of consumers. So I would say that we have come a long way, and we have initiated targeting activities for the vulnerable groups. And I believe such studies, such analysis can be only a good positive example, and that can be seriously taken into consideration once further measures and policies are identified in order to reduce energy poverty. Yes, that should be the aim of the government, to have targeted measures. Now, in the interest of time, since the entire event has been a bit postponed. I would like to open the panel for Q&A.
Излагања. Моето прашање всушност разпоставување на блок тарифи за господинот Беслимовски, меѓутоа и за господинот Андонов би можел да се однесе. Првото прашање ми е дали е утврдено колку се заштедите кои што се овозможени преку поведување на оваа методологија, која што сметам дека е
So I believe that when we talk about the block tariffs, and this is a huge step forward, have you had any analysis to what extent savings have been made and to what end? Either to prevent abuse or to actually save energy, because we know that irrational utilization of energy is probably one of the, maybe not most essential, but one of the causes for actually experiencing such situations, such a crisis. So it's not only due to the spending of the households, but also the entire economic consumption and expenditure. And the second thing is that we do have a positive discrimination when it comes to families with multiple children, when it comes to, as a result of this study. So is the Public Revenue Office in a situation to provide statistics in order to cross-match this data? Because I come from such a family having multiple members. So, and if so, what can be done in order to make a more adequate analysis to ascertain the true vulnerability of that category of families or households? Thank you. Should I go and answer them or? Okay. When it comes to the application of the blocks, when we introduced the blocks, we had the consumption structure per household and kilowatt consumption. We were surprised that maybe 80% spend less than 500 kilowatt per hour, and that's a lot of households, the majority of households. We had a situation of having 1% of households spending 20% of the entire consumption within a household. That means households refer to also kindergartens and so on, but also households, families that would spend electricity in excess, no savings at all, because the electricity fee was low, electricity was cheap, and for an energy poor country, this is a problem when you have extraordinarily high consumption compared to the rest. And now we are making analysis to identify the application of the blocks in May, June, July. We could see the effects, but that was due to the weather conditions because it wasn't as warm as previous summers. However, even though the winter was mild, we have a 14, 15, 16% of reduction in consumption. And now we are identifying to what extent this is due to the blocks or other types of measures. And one degree warmer every month means 1% less of consumption. That means that the consumption was reduced by 14%. So the signal that we wanted to send was sent. And in the forthcoming period, that will continue to multiply and exponentially grow. So we're going to have reduced consumption on the level of a household. irrespective of whether people have or do not have money, energy is consumed, and an essential problem is heating when fueled by electricity, and that is why we have a high annual consumption due to electricity-fueled heating. But then we have to introduce more and different policies. We have energy efficiency systems, inverters, so we have to help households so they can invest in energy efficiency. Now, when it comes to the Public Revenue Office statistics and revenues, it's going to be a very difficult job, but we will have to make the study. We do have gray economy. Things are not black and white, but we have to be able to know whom we need to provide assistance. And we do have feed-in tariffs. We're going to introduce feed-in tariffs, but compared to the EU standards, we do have cheap electricity. Compared to Bosnia, Albania, Serbia, I think Serbia is the only country having a cheaper electricity price than Macedonia. But they did introduce renewable source fee. So we have to be able to identify whom are we going to help. Now we're helping everybody. And now, we shouldn't do that. There are categories, because it's very clear, if you enter the fourth block, you can invest and reduce consumption. But for 30 years, we are helping all. Those that are rich and able to sustain themselves. So electricity is cheap, so the person or the family has built a swimming pool, outdoor swimming pool, and they are spending excessively electricity. It's cheap for them and so on. So in addition to this, the price of the electricity for household should fairly reflect the real costs of the companies, so they can effectively operate and they can generate income and revenue, but also provide sufficient electricity. The Public Revenue Office will have to present the data. We will have to go in the field, do a census, but if we have committed to it, we're going to complete it within a year's time. In parallel, we will have to go in the field and generally check the counters, because in most cases, around 2,000 households that are social beneficiaries, social assistance beneficiaries, around 1,400 had their fee another name. So either they are paying rent or another family member is in charge of the bill. So once we go in the field and identify all of this, we're going to do a database on the basis of which we will be able to adopt real policies that will assist the most vulnerable category of consumers. Mr. Andonov, just to add, when it comes to the input by the Public Revenue Office, yes, it will be difficult, but we have to do it. In the past 3 years, especially following the pandemics, a lot of measures were implemented targeting vulnerable citizens. We need to identify the analysis. I forgot about the EMS and ESM issues. The situation that we have is not unique to our country. The same happens to Serbia. We need to build an energy sustainable system, and we're not going to have that if we transfer 100 or 200 million euros to ESM every year. And that has been recognized as such by the financial institutions. This is also recognized by the World Bank, so we cannot go unhindered with this type of funding, and that is the aim of the new policy building and in favor of providing assistance to the most vulnerable groups. That is, we need to provide help only to targeted consumers. We have to do it irrespective of the time that we will require. We have the sufficient knowledge and the capacity. The Regulatory Commission is here, the Public Revenue Office, the Ministry of Economy, Labor and Social Policy Ministry, the State Statistics Office as well. So I think that we will be able to join efforts, and it's not going to be an ideal, so let's just start. And within a period of 3 to 5 years to have a solid base to tackle energy poverty. Thank you. Obviously, a lot of things need to be discussed when it comes to this particular topic. I had a lot of transition-related issues because it will bring about a lot of challenges when it comes to the green economy and so on, but the time for the panel discussion ended, so if we have other questions after the second panel, we can discuss during the cocktail informally. Thank you very much to the panelists, and I would like to announce now the second panel, but just to change the arrangement. Thank you.
Добро, веднаш.
Now we shall continue with the second panel. Adjustments in service provision to families and children. If we consider problems at national level, it is necessary also to consider this at local level. In this context, I would like to invite the participants in the second panel, Aco Ristov, Mayor of Radovic and President of the Committee for Monitoring the System of Financing the Municipalities, Tuma Christovsky, Mayor of Krushevo, Alexandra Arsovska, Director of the Intermunicipal Center for Social Work, Kumanovo, and Zlatko Ivanova from the Intermunicipal Center for Social Work in Štip. Welcome to the panel. This panel discussion is dedicated to the impact of the crisis on institutions providing services to children and families, and also from the aspect of the challenges faced by the institutions regarding the increased expenditures. I also have a question for the mayors. So can you all please answer from your own perspective, which are the problems faced by the municipalities in provision of basic services and the conditions of increased prices, which are not always accompanied by adequate increase in the block grants? We would like to hear the problems that you face, such as lack of funds in order to cover the costs. Also, when you have to cut the school classes in order to ensure saving, how you manage to tackle this, installment of photovoltaics on municipal buildings, improving the energy efficiency, finding ways how to provide electricity in alternative ways, and how can the central government additionally help you? Mr. Aco Ristov. Thank you for the invitation. This is a very general topic, and in the whole infrastructure in the municipalities, there is a huge range of measures and problems that we face on daily basis, especially as part of the system for managing the local resources. You know, we have a formal competence in all areas of life, such as the preschool education, primary education, secondary education, sport, culture, urbanism, etc. If this energy crisis did not take place and the crisis that happened with the pandemics, probably we would still behave in not the best way with the energy, especially with regard to the funding we get from the block grants. This is the eternal war between decentralization and the fiscal decentralization and the needs of citizens. We, the mayors or the local government, are the only ones who are indirectly providers of services to citizens, and we are the ones who should be managing the funds on any ground. And there are a very few grounds. What could we have done, especially as of last year when we had the energy crisis? Many of the municipalities were shocked, and it required a rapid response. Many municipalities reallocated the budget items. Our electricity bills and also for the public lighting were 4 times or 5 times bigger. Also, public utilities generated loss. I guess we will be trying to cover those losses this year, thanks to the measures taken before New Year by the Regulatory Commission and the government that at least schools and public enterprises to get subsidies for electricity. However, the damage was already done. For a whole year, we had damages for which we will have to cover up for the next years. Let's go back to the topic. What can we do and how are we dealing with the problems, let's say, in the kindergartens? There are several ways how to tackle this problem. What everyone is saying about healthy meals. You know that the parents provide subsidies for the meals. Subsidies are not provided by the country. No one would increase the price of food for children. So it's up to 30 euros depending on the city, depending on how much the parent is paying. But this is such a little amount. And of course, there is no quality of food. Therefore, the municipalities should often assist. Sometimes we reallocate the funds that we need for infrastructural projects. Also, the loan legalization is also affecting us. And this is like a vicious circle from which we cannot get out simply like that. Municipalities are another government. We are not from another country. We are part of the country. And the vertical coordination between the central and local levels should be better. The fiscal decentralization in Macedonia is at the last place in Europe. There are arguments pro and against, and we shouldn't go into details about this. How are the directors coping and the mayors coping with this situation? The biggest challenge this year was the transportation, electricity, and heating for schools. Most of the schools are using oil. We shifted to other fast ways. We designed our own projects to substitute for the electricity. Many mayors already have realized some projects whereby we try to ensure energy non-dependent institutions, and then we have a system of independent cities. This is the target that we want to achieve. because if we release money from the electricity for the school system, those money can be used to increase the quality of services. We reached an agreement with the Regulatory Commission that finally we can release the energy market. Previously, the municipalities could not take the role of producers of electricity. This was allowed only for private and commercial enterprises. Now we have found a way for the municipalities also to register as producers. So through the electricity, we also provide heating energy. So in the following period, because there are no rapid movements in energy sector, one has to make a project, implement the project, get a license. All the municipalities, mayors are concentrated on this. In small schools, they have the producer-consumer effect, up to 40 kilowatt hours electricity, but we will be able to see the effects next year. I do hope that the market will stabilize. We faced a huge problem with the transportation. This was also highlighted in many of the data due to the increase in the price of oil. You know that schools should provide transportation from their own funds. Especially cities with schools, satellite schools, they face a problem that they do not provide transportation, blackmailing by transporters. So these are, I would like to say, huge items. If 78% of all the money in education go to salary, only 13% goes to all other material expenses. So of course we cannot survive in this way. Often many of the cities substitute or help the schools. The idea is not to do it like that. That is why this year, together with UNICEF, we're working on the new formula for allocation of the block grants according to other criteria. We think that this will tackle the gap between the number of teachers, students, and quality of education. Even though a lot of investments were made through the block grants, we are all aware that the quality of education is going downwards. We have less students in the classes. This should increase the quality, but actually something opposite is happening here. I guess we became aware of many things during this period. We try as much as possible, but without the support of the central government. We do have legal obstacles. We do have schools that only have 2 or 3 students. We need to be thinking how to change this, to improve the transportation. So we have started thinking how to organize our own transportation for the students, because this will reduce the material expenses and there will be more funds for investments. We have not provided any capital investments in the schools for many times. These days we're discussing with the school directors if at least we can make some projects. You know that the norms for projects were adopted, so it will cost 30,000 to 50,000 euros to draft a new project, which will take up the whole budget of the school. Many changes are happening on the market with regard to investments. We all try to provide only one shift of schooling. Many of the cities cannot provide this. Many schools work in 2 shifts, which means there is no possibility for extracurricular activities. Children cannot use the capacities of the school in the afternoon, so we do have challenges. But together, with arguments and facts, things will change. Today we have a session of CELS to discuss the new formulas, and I do hope that with regard to energy and transportation, gradually we will provide developments. This was a shock, but gradually I think we will tackle the crisis. Thank you, Mr. Christovsky. Put things like in Grushovo. Grushovo has an ideal position for energy projects. Tell us what are your experiences. Thank you for inviting me, the organizers of this great event, where we have an opportunity to introduce ourselves, but also to complain, but also to suggest something to all the stakeholders. The energy and finance crisis is something that affects all of us, both at central and local level. What does this mean for all of us as municipalities? Which means that the price of electricity is up, starting with the street lights, increased costs for the kindergartens, early childhood development, primary and secondary education. We have 2 municipal central schools and 3 satellite schools. We are a small municipality with modest budget. This crisis also affected us, and we are only striving to use the funds both at central or international level. We work with UNICEF, UNDP, etc. All mayors were affected by this crisis because we had many unreasonable costs in the past. One should not forget that until 2017, in Grushovo we had rural areas where the students were still studying in substandard conditions in the 3 rooms. The conditions were terrifying, while infrastructure was being constructed which was not needed. So that is why we focus on the national funds. UNDP in the last period provided us a lot of assistance. We reconstructed 2 of the schools in the settlements. 2 more will be renovated by the Ministry of Education. We reconstructed the sporting hall, the primary school, but this is not enough. In order to have energy-efficient premises and primary schools, we should have dealt with this long time ago, such as installing photovoltaics and providing for other basic living conditions, and independent educational institutions where children will have normal conditions. Having in mind that we are a small municipality with a modest budget, we welcome the decision of the government with regard to subsidies for the electricity in the kindergarten and the primary school, because 90% of the budget and the grants were used for salaries and basic materials for both for teachers and for students. Therefore, we started reconstructing the existing facilities in order to provide proper energy conditions for the teaching staff and the children to be provided with proper conditions for teaching.
We also had excellent cooperation with all the stakeholders, UNICEF, USAID, UNDP, with whom jointly we did something that we are all proud of as a local authority, municipality, and as a country. When we think about the children, we need to do more. Thank you. Apparently the schools are probably the highest priority of the municipalities, and hopefully you'll find proper solutions in order to improve and upgrade the schooling, the learning conditions, especially and for all the citizens, especially those that are socially most vulnerable. Now we're going to talk about the duties of the Center for Social Work. For you, Ms. Arsovska and Ms. Ivanova, I have the same question. How has the crisis affected you, the Center for Social Work, as providers of services? Have you had an increase in the number of recipients, beneficiaries? Have you had any multiplication in terms of types of problems that you're facing? So to what extent you've been affected, such as lack of funds in order to cover the heating, electricity expenses, the ways in which you're trying to overcome these issues, and how can additional assistance be provided to you in order to overcome the obstacles? Ms. Arsovska, thank you very much. It is my honor to attend this event, and shortly I would like to cover all of the aspects that refer to this very serious topic. I am representing the Inter-Municipal Center for Social Work Kumanovo that covers 3 municipalities, Starona Goričina, Lipkovo and Kumanovo, which means around 34,000 beneficiaries, both adults and minors, or a fourth of the total number of the population within these 3 municipalities. As CSWs, since 2019, we have faced a lot of challenges. First was in the adoption of the new social protection law in 2019. The second was the pandemic crisis, and the third, we are facing the energy crisis. The implementation of the new law for social protection meant full restructuring of the institutions. And even back then we started with savings, vehicle depreciation, savings in fuel. Now we have only one expert, professional person that mines that is dedicated per household within a territory, and now we have reduced the personnel engaged to conduct oversight. This integrated approach has been very beneficial with regard to the fact that the professional advises a household when it comes to all the social protection entitlements, rights, and services by sending an application, a request to the CSW. In addition to that, the new law meant a lack of elimination of certain entitlements, meaning that if the household is a GTA beneficiary, then GMA beneficiary, that household is eligible for other child allowance, education allowance, disability allowance, third-party benefit, disability benefit, and so on. The global pandemic crisis from the coronavirus was faced with another challenge, adjustment of the newly working conditions, but alleviated circumstances by having mitigation provided by the government measures, having facilitated access to certain social benefits, and we had an influx of increased number of requests because a lot of people remained jobless. The center as an institution back then was quite beneficial in terms of providing services for those that were left without jobs during the COVID crisis. We processed applications and requirements promptly, and we managed to help those that face existential crisis and to swiftly enter them into the social benefit system. We already know that irrespective of the challenges that we face as an institution, we have to be up to our task because our delivery is synchronized with the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy. We have specific time and interval of provision of services, and we have to be ready because a lot of beneficiaries depend on us. The way we had accelerated swift and increased entry of a lot of applicants and beneficiaries, the same way we have to provide for their exit. What does that mean? I will quote Article 20 of the law of social protection. Means that anyone will have to mine his or her own livelihood and the person he or she is in charge of as a guardian. So each one will have to prevent or contribute to preventing social risks to which he or she is exposed, or the member families, and actively engages towards overcoming the conditions of exposure to social risk. So in addition to the crisis, we introduced a new activity, and that is activation of all active job seekers that at the same time are beneficiaries of GMA. We started to draft activation plans together with the Employment Service Agency, on the basis of which I can surely say that at the start of 2021, the total number of beneficiaries of GMA was 2,958. Now we have 500 beneficiaries of reduction, maybe not always due to their employability, but also due to their mobility as well. It is also beneficial to emphasize that when employers seek employees, they're quite competitive in providing terms of service, and then providing meals on the job. And for all the active seekers, job opportunities have been better devised and designed, and alleviating circumstance as a result of certain steps taken by the Ministry of Labour and Social Policy are the following. Access to rights by citizens has been facilitated. With the interoperability, most of the rights are being exercised without additional documentation that are being provided for ex officio from the Cadastre, Real Estate, Public Revenue Office, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Agriculture. And if previously we had the situation of beneficiaries having the obligation to submit documentation and application, the annual renewal of documents, now the changes are such that in the material, the changes are being monitored through the system electronically. We are aligning and adjusting with the living costs annually. So we did adjustments February to March, and we have had almost 20% of increase when it comes to exercising the GMA and energy subsidy right. 4,800 denars is the GMA for an individual single person, compared to 2019 that was 4,000 denars, and the energy subsidy 1,230 denars. When it comes to the energy crisis and how as an institution we are tackling the energy crisis, I can say that following the guidelines of the ministries, we had to implement various steps to save energy. We are in the open labor market as an independent institutions, and through public procurements we procure. July and August, we had the alarm switched on when the energy price reached its maximum, and thereafter we had to implement certain steps because the operation of our institution was put into question by the end of the year. By closing one building and one operator that was the biggest consumer, we managed to exit the risky threshold, but as a result of the serious steps we undertook, we had savings in kilowatt hours on average of 55%. When it comes to the savings, and thanks to the ministry that undertook certain measures, you already know that every year as Center Kumanovo we had to adopt 15,000 applications or decisions that had to be printed out, submitted to the beneficiaries. All of this is done electronically, so for the first time we have had electronic. As an institution, we legalized all of the buildings that were not owned by the Center for Social Work in Kumanovo, and also we conducted an energy efficiency elaborate or a study. And because we're fully dependent on the municipal budget, we hope that in the forthcoming period we will have an improvement of the energy efficiency.
Кои што навистина треба да бидеме на висина на задачата, не само во однос на заштита.
Not when it comes to safeguarding only resources that are budget-based, but to provide the most effective service for the citizens that seek our assistance. Thank you very much, Ms. Arsovska. It is good to be able to hear all of the activities that you undertake on the level of municipal CSW. What is the condition or situation in Štip, the Center for Social Work in Štip? It is my honor to be a part of this panel discussion on a topic that, as employees, we have been engaged to prevent and detect the risks and to tackle the risks in the field with the vulnerable categories. The Center for Social Work Štip has competences over 2 municipalities, Štip and Karbinci. Štip has been regionally positioned as an eastern center towards which a lot of people migrate. Risks are therefore increased. And now we're talking about unforeseen transition, so that poses an additional risk. I wouldn't like to repeat what Alexandra said about the CSW's competencies. It was important to have the 2019 reform introduced into the law on social protection, as well as the urgent or emergency provisions adopted during the pandemic that were preparatory documents in order then to further tackle the crisis and emergency situation. The Center for Social Work in Štip had an increased number of guaranteed minimum assistance beneficiaries. Over 70% of we had an increase of households recipients of GMA. With other institutions together, because we work multi-sectorally, which is a very important approach. So the main reason for that was the closing down of textile plants and factories that are dominant employers in Štip. There were a lot of layoffs. Part of the employees did receive contributions, but part of them directly entered the social protection system as beneficiaries. Now we're trying to prepare activation plans, regular coordination sessions, engaged coordinators by the Centers for Social Work and Employment Service agencies in order to provide employment for the most employable beneficiaries that have necessary educational background and qualifications. For the more difficult beneficiaries, when it comes to employability, they are being offered training, certificates to be acquired in known employers, and that is not being calculated as income whenever they exercise the right to a guaranteed minimum assistance. Now, next, when we need to address the energy consumption crisis, together with the rest of the CSWs, we already know we have received guidelines and instructions by the ministry in order to prevent the situation, how to save energy, how to save fuel, for which we have prepared instructions and further guidelines for dissemination by the employees. We hope that in the next period you will be able to successfully tackle the challenges. If the audience has certain questions, feel free to pose them to our panelists.
I would like to thank the speakers. I have a question for the two mayors. Whether the mayors you represent pay a housing allowance in accordance with the law on social welfare, which is paid also to beneficiaries of guaranteed minimal assistance. In cooperation with the Center for Social Work Kruševo, we sent a request for a list of people belonging to the vulnerable categories. So our municipality would provide additional assistance. Yes, we do pay one-time assistance. It's not something done publicly. And together with socially responsible companies, not only from Kruševo but from the whole region, we donated assistance to all vulnerable categories from our assistance, also during the COVID-19 pandemics and also now for the financial and energy crisis. And I would like to extend gratitude to these companies, because they are really socially responsible companies, and we to target the right citizens, and the assistance provided on our side should go to the right place. What about the situation in Radović? I don't know what kind of assistance you're asking about. Within our remit, we can exempt them from payment of utility expenses. They don't pay the bills for water supply, for garbage collection. We also made a step forward. So for all those who have children in the kindergarten, they don't pay anything for that. The municipality covers the expenses. Those parents are also exempted from transportation costs. And we provide this for students and for socially vulnerable categories. We provide free transportation. That is, we provide subsidies to the citizens to reach the centers for social work in the cities in order to get services from hospitals, lawyers, courts, etc. And we try to do this outside this system of provided by the Labor and Social Policy Ministry. We try to do our best, but we have limited possibilities. Our budgets are created only to cover part of these costs. In Radović, we pay on a monthly basis around 350,000 euros for social affairs, because there are many citizens who are capable of work, however, we cannot reach out to them. Community work is cancelled, we cannot hire them, and we have to pay private companies for those services, especially for hiring people to work on public cleanliness and green areas. We have to pay for private services instead of hiring those citizens. We have to restore such norms, because this way we stimulate the grey economy. Many of these citizens work in private companies, however, they are not registered. They work for a per diem, which is not that small, especially in the agriculture sector. And over there, there is no control, especially when there is a huge demand for such labor force. So the fee they get daily is 2,000 dinars and above. We have to start thinking in a different way. We do have people capable of work that we cannot reach out to them. Some of them are protected categories. Not all people are what the system is registering about. The Centers for Social Work should work on the ground. And this is why we are at war with them. But this is something to be solved. If I may add up something, I think your question is right, because housing allowance was a burning issue, especially here for us at the Centers for Social Work, because the municipalities in general do not have a program how to settle the housing costs. This refers especially to payment of the rent for people who do not have their own properties but use the guaranteed minimal assistance. Even though all municipalities started adopting such a program to provide subsidies for this right, the basic problem is that none of the lessors would make a contract. In order to exercise this right, they need to have such a contract with the lessor. So that is why they cannot exercise this right. Thank you, Ms. Ivanova. I would like to share information. As an advisor, as a councillor in the municipality of Štip, I drafted this rule book and it is voted. We are one of the rare municipalities that have such a rule book. Thank you. Now I wrap up or close this panel. You have a question? Okay, feel free to ask the question. I would like to add something to what the mayor said. You're saying that your municipality has limited possibilities and that the Center for Social Work should start working on the ground. I think we should look at things from the opposite way. All the municipalities in our country allocate more funds for passive measures such as one-off assistance, packages, subsidies, exemption from payment of utility bills. What the municipalities can do, in fact, they can invest the money in trainings. So you can give money for certain professions, for certain social services, and also encourage the unemployed people. Instead of coming and asking for a one-time assistance, they can make an association that provides health social services or something else. Another option that will be promoted in future is, according to the law, the municipalities can buy such service, purchase such services, such as cleaning green areas. That is a great idea, and I'm sure that very soon we will adopt the law on social enterprises. We will have such enterprises of people who can be activated on the labor market. That is why I think the municipalities should start thinking about active measures rather than passive measures, so that funds can be provided to those in need. Many municipalities have developed certain services, together with the Ministry, World Bank and other projects, and the capacity is limited to 10 service providers. They need 10 more, and then they approach the state to provide them money for the trainings. The money they provide as one-off assistance can be invested in training, and this way capacities can be increased. This is just one comment, that the municipalities can make quite a big contribution at local level in terms of how to activate the vulnerable people and work together with the centers in order to detect the people who are capable of work. Also to design measures or operational measures. We have the biggest budget for those measures, and I do hope together all of us and the companies can work together in order to activate and capacitate these people to work, because when they stay at home, this creates other problems such as depression and other unwanted consequences in the family. That is why activation is very important by the municipality. Thank you for mentioning this to encourage me to this discussion. Thank you for your comments. Just briefly, Municipality of Kruševo, together with the World Bank and the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, hired 20 people to assist and care for old people, and other 15 people are hired for community work. During the summer period, we hired 20 more people, unemployed people. This way, we improve the public cleanliness. This is how we target the people who are not employed. We motivate them to be activated. Thank you. Thank you. We can continue the debate during the cocktail outside. Once again, I would like to thank the panelists, UNICEF and Finance Think for all these debates and for giving us the possibility to share the experiences. Thank you.